Hello everyone, today we are going to talk about what preference shares are. So let's see what preference shares are. What are preference shares? Preference shares are also known as preferred stock or preferred shares. So let's see what preference shares are. Preference shares are shares which are preferred over common or equity stocks. So that means that if a company is paying out stocks to the shareholders, the preference shareholders are the one who will get first the dividends, and then rest of the surplus will be given to equity shareholders. So preference shares or owners of the preference shareholders gets fixed dividends. So we'll have a lot more information regarding what preference shares are. So the first is, during the winding up of a company, preference shareholders will get repaid their capital prior to that of equity shareholders. That means if this equity shareholders, if the company is bound to wound up, the preference shareholders will be first to get their capital repaid as compared to equity shareholders. So the preference shareholders, next characteristics of preference shareholders are, preference shareholders do not carry voting rights as of an equity shareholders. When the company is making decisions for the management, the preference shareholders will not have a say in it, or they will not be able to get a voting right for the same. So the dividends of preference shareholders will only be paid when there is surplus or profit in the company. So let's talk about what are the different types of preference shares. So the first is cumulative preference shares and non-cumulative preference shares. The next is convertible preference shares and non-convertible preference shares. Next is participative preference shares and non-participative preference shares. Then the fifth one is perpetual preference shares, and the last one is prior preference shares. So we'll each look at what all these preference shares are. The first is cumulative and non-cumulative preference shares. So cumulative preference shares are those shares the right of the dividend are arrearing even when in which the company makes profit. These are known as cumulative preference shares. So in case the company do not declare dividend for a particular year, that year's dividend for a preference shares will be arrear. And when the next year, when the company makes a profit, that will be given to the preference shareholders to the subsequent years. That is what, in case the company do not declare dividends for a particular year, then they are treated as arrears and are carried forward to next year. When the arrears pertaining to dividend are cumulative in nature and such arrears are cleared before any dividend payment to equity shareholders, then it is known as cumulative preference shares. Next, we look at what non-cumulative preference shares are. So, a non-cumulative preference shares is a share which is only payable when the company makes a profit. So, if a company undergoes a loss during a year, then the outstanding payment of dividend cannot be claimed in subsequent years, like in the case of cumulative preference shares. So when a company doesn't earn profit for a particular year, a non-cumulative preference shareholders will not get dividend during that year, and that amount of dividend will not be arreared to the next year. But in case of a cumulative preference shares, such dividends will be arreared to the next year, and then that dividend will be paid out as a subsequent year. Next, we'll see what is the other kind of dividend. Redeemable and irredeemable preference shares. So, preference shares which can be redeemed after a fixed period of time or after a certain period of time, such kind of preference shares are known as redeemable preference shares. And irredeemable or non-redeemable preference shares are those shares which have a perpetual liability and which cannot be redeemed during the lifetime of the business. Next kind of preference shares are participating and non-participating preference shares. So we look at what participating preference shares are. Participating preference shares are those shares that have the right to participate in the surplus amount that is paid by the company. So during liquidation or during a year when a company is making surplus profit, a participative preference shareholders will have the chance to participate in getting the surplus amount of profit. Before that, the preference shares will only get a fixed dividend, whatever is allotted to them. But in case of a participative preference shareholders, they'll be able to participate in the surplus that the company makes. That is what a participative preference shareholders are. The preference shareholders usually receives stipulated rate of dividend, that like I told you, and they also will able to participate in the surplus that the company makes along with the equity shareholders. Next, we are going to talk about non-participating preference shareholders or shares. Preference shares having no right to participate in the surplus of a company, that is during the liquidation of a company, that is known as non-participative preference shares. Here, the preference shareholders receive only a particular stable rate of dividend and they are not liable to get any extra surplus or extra profit that the company makes, unlike participative preference shareholders. Next type of preference shares are convertible and non-convertible preference shares. So, convertible preference shares are those type of shares which can be converted to equity shares onto the company or by the company, where the shareholders has the option to convert into common stock or common equity shareholdings. That is known as convertible preference shares. Non-convertible preference shares are those shares which does not have the option to convert it into an equity shareholders. But you have to keep in mind that the convertible preference shareholders can convert it into equity shares in a certain period if it is agreed in their memorandum. So if the memorandum of association of a company does agree that the preference shareholders has the right to convert it into equity shares, they can be called as a convertible preference shareholders, or such shares are known as convertible preference shares. Next type of preference shares is perpetual preference shares. So a perpetual preference shares is a type of preferred shares or a preferred stock which pays a fixed dividend to the investors as long as the company is running. So when the company is running for a long period of time, until the company winds up, till that time the shareholders will be receiving a stable dividend. Such kind of preference shares are known as perpetual preference shares. So it does not have a maturity or a specific buyback date, and it is more or like a redeemable preference shares where there is no fixed redeemable time. Perpetual preference share has characteristics that are similar to a bond with an extremely long maturity date. Next type of preference shares are known as prior preference shares. So a prior preference stock is that type of shares which has a priority over other kinds of preference shares. So we discussed what the other kinds of preference shares are. There are convertible preference shares, participative preference shares, redeemable preference shares. So a prior preference shares is those type of shares which have a priority to get the dividend even before the set types of preferred shares. So this shares is usually traded in a public company and it has one more priority to the different types of preference shares. Thus, while all preferred stock receives dividends before the common stock, prior preferred stock receives dividend before other preferred stock. So these are the different types of preference shares. Thank you.